So what I want to do is look at some ideas about, so what is the goal in the next hour? That is to look at some conceptual and some critical ideas around architecture, the relationship between architecture, bodily experience, and sensing. Now, what I mean by sensing is how things, either humans or the environment, sense the world. I make sense of it, but also take in stimuli, try to perceive that stimuli and do something with that stimuli. Okay. And to think about what does it mean to have a body within these environments that sense us more and more and more. So we're also right now, everyone's got a phone probably in this room. This phone has tons of sensors in it. It has an accelerometer, which allows you to measure the amount of gravity that you have when you move the phone in space. Or let's say it measures the amount of motion in XYZ axis. The phone has a light sensor, so it manages to change the screen opacity when the light changes in the room. So this device is a kind of sensor, right? It has a lot of sensors and it senses the environment. But of course, it's related to us because we're also holding it and changing it and moving it around. So we must understand something about that device. So we have this relationship between that device and our own sensing body, which is also trying to, we have a bunch of sensors in us as well, right? We have eyes, we have ears, we have noses, we have mouths, we have skin. All of these are also sensors, and those sensors go to each of these sense organs, sends a lot of data to neurons that also sense and try to make sense, and then goes to the brain and to the skeletal and the muscular and the so-called sensory motor system of our body. So this is key to understanding something, how we make then sense of what this sensing device does. So you could think about sensing both human and machine as somehow interrelated with each other. They're very different. The sensors in this device are much, much cruder than the sensors in our bodies, because we have the benefit in our bodies of evolution, thousands and millions of years of those sensors perfecting themselves, developing a better sense of how they perceive the environment, whereas this device is, basically some cheap sensors, very, very cheap sensors put together by Foxconn in China and then sent you in this device. So what does it mean to sense the world from our bodies when the rooms or the environments we're in sense us? And how then do we relate to that? So that's what I want to talk about a little bit today. And I'm going to give you some very concrete projects that try to deal with that. So I'm going to do a couple of things. First of all, I'm going to give you some starting questions. And they come from this funny book called Architectural Body. And this is a book by two artists, one partially trained as an architect in Japan, the other a poet. Both of them have passed away, which is important for what they were working on. But what they imagined, this is Madeline Gins and Arakawa, what they imagined was to think about the relationship between our bodies in architectural surrounds, environments that surround us. And it could be very, very similar. It doesn't have to be a very sophisticated environment. It could be just this room. We're sitting in this room right now. It's a perfect Euclidean room. It's like a kind of a rectangle. It doesn't have very good acoustics because basically rectangular rooms are not very good acoustically. We have to do all sorts of things. I mean, this room is relatively okay in terms of my voice. It has carpet. The carpet absorbs things. The carpet is not a very nice color. Walls is very clinical in the space. So, but we're in this room. So this room surrounds us, and we have to occupy this room. This room doesn't really have much relationship to our bodies. The room doesn't tell our body what to do. We kind of assume we have these desks, we sit down, and that's what we do. We sit down. But what would it mean for the room and our bodies to be related to each other in a really interesting way, where our bodies tell the room what to do and the room tells our bodies what to do, like in a mutual correspondence? And this is what these two architects or artists talked about, and I'll show you some of their work. And the questions come from this book, and they're not easy to answer because they're kind of let's say puzzles. So I'm going to start with those questions. Then I'm going to give you some background of what I've been working on, what the immersive art space at ZHdK is working on, and then let's give you some some ideas about what does it mean to think about the collaboration between us and the environment together. And I'm going to bring in some ideas that come from cognitive science, particularly an area of cognitive science called embodied cognition, which deals very much with the fact that our bodies are central to how we cognitize the world and make sense of it. And then I'm going to give you some artistic works as examples for our discussion afterwards that I've done before I came to Zurich and then recently. So let's start off with 3 questions that Arakawa and Gins ask us, okay? So the first is, in what respects and how variegatedly do physical surroundings invite bodily action? In other words, how do the environments that we're in invite certain ways of acting in them? Okay, that's the first thing. And the works I'm going to show you try to explore this in a kind of concrete way. The second is a more crazy kind of question. How far out into the environment does an organism that persons extend? Okay, now this is a very strange idea from Arakawa and Gins, but this idea that an organism, okay, let's say an entity that's composed of different components, that persons, that acts like a person, extend out into the environment. So that's the second question. This is meant to be kind of a strange question. And the third is, to what extent do surroundings influence thoughts and actions? Okay, so of course, thoughts are influenced certainly by the spaces we're in all the time. You know, if you get tired of listening to me, you can turn and look at the trees behind you. This room is kind of like it's white. So certainly influences kind of what we're thinking. If you're on Facebook or on some other thing, listening to me, you can, that influences it. But what kind of actions does this environment influence? So, or this surrounding, this thing that is around us and surrounds us, what does that do? Okay. So these are 3 questions that that Arakawa and Gins ask us about thinking about what they call an architectural body. In other words, not a body that is in architecture, but a body that is itself in architecture, which is a really interesting idea, because we tend to think of like just think about the spaces you walk through every day. They're not really built for us as human beings. They're built as containers for us to go through, but they're not built really thinking of ourselves as part of that architecture. So this is a very interesting thinking that they try to pose to us. I'll just show you just quickly their website, which is, of course, hidden behind the Zoom thing. And it's so, as I said, both of these architects passed away. And why I say that is because they had a really kind of crazy and radical idea. They wanted to create what they called an architecture of reversible destiny. In other words, what kind of architecture could you create? And this is a challenging question. What kind of architecture could you create so that you could become immortal? And they called this reversible destiny because they said what architecture could do is reverse the course of aging. Now, how could it do that? Well, for them, the idea of dying was not just the death of the physical body. It was the idea that of perceptual routine, that your perception would get so trained that everyday experience would be completely boring, completely routine, that nothing new would challenge your body and your senses. And as one gets older, in fact, your senses do tend to get dull. They tend to slowly grind down. Some people lose them. Some they become less attentive. So you have to constantly train your senses like you want to train your own body as you also get older. This is their website called reversibledestiny.org. And we'll talk about some of the projects they were imagining. But the idea then of reversible destiny was an architecture that could reverse the course of death, which is to change this belief that the environment would become routine to us and we would basically perceptually adapt to it. And it would no longer challenge us in any interesting, powerful ways. Now, that's an interesting idea, but how does it get realized? And how could we think about that in an interesting way? So I'll go back. So let me give you some background to explain where I'm coming from. So I'm a professor for immersive arts and director of a space called the Immersive Art Space down in the ZHdK. If you're interested, the website is here. It's basically blog.zhdk.ch and then /immersive arts. So the Immersive Art Space is essentially a mix between a research lab, a teaching environment, and we also do production. So in fact, if anyone's near Basel, this week we have 2 projects going up at this festival called Mesh, which is at the House of Electronic Arts. Starts on Wednesday. Which is a big digital arts festival with many international artists and designers and thinkers. I'm also professor emeritus, so I had another position before I came to Zurich in design and computation arts in Canada for a long time. And basically, my background is I work as an artist, I work as a professor, I also work as a scholar. I write things, I manage things, and I curate things. And we've shown artistic works around all these very large museums around the world, the Venice Biennale, Berliner Festspiele in Berlin, the Barbican Center in London, National Art Museum in China, many things. And also written a number of books. And today I'm going to focus on this book in particular, which basically came out in 2022. Yeah, I have to move all these things.
I will give you some.
Yes, thanks. This book deals with basically what I was bringing up. How does sensors shape our everyday experience? Yeah, it's always trying to get rid of these stupid Zoom things when it's already running. Yeah, you can also, yeah.
Should I leave it? I just don't see your pointer.
Yeah, it disappears because it's, yeah. So.
Okay.
So sensing machines deals with basically how sensors shape our everyday experience. And if you think about it, from the beginning of the talk, I was saying sensors are everywhere, right? They're in our phones, they're in our clothes, they're in our appliances, they're in our cars, they're in artworks, they're in our food, they're everywhere. And how do those sensors shape our experience of the world? So this book kind of deals with that, and I'm going to pick up some ideas from it. So here's the second question. So I gave you the first 3 questions from Arakawa and Gins. How do we think about the relation between our environment and our body and the organism and the body and the environment? And then the second question is, if perception and interaction are relational, I'll talk about them in a second. How do we interact in environments which themselves sense? Okay, how do we understand the environment itself that senses when we are ourselves sensing beings in that environment? So I'm going to talk about 3 artistic projects. I'm going to explain them briefly now, which pick up some of these questions. So this is a project called Haptic Field, done in 2016 to 2019. And what happens here, and I'll show you some video in a second, but what happens in this piece is that the audience, 20 people at a time, visitors to a museum, not trained performers, come to the space and they put on clothing, and this clothing has in it haptic actuators. So haptics, of course, you probably know, are basically is a science of applying information to the surface of the skin using essentially electronics and mechanical devices. You have haptics in your phone, you have them also in your if you have an iWatch or other kinds of devices that give you vibration to tell you what time it is, or they send you information. So what happens is that these devices are placed in this clothing on your body, and they're in certain places where you have quite, let's say, quite sensitive response. The most sensitive response is to tactile information at the fingertips and the bottom of your feet, whereas, for instance, your back is less sensitive to stimuli, to basically, and there's different levels of stimuli, which we get into later. Okay. And then these devices, so there's 7, there's 2 on the legs, there's 2 on the arms, there's 1 on the chest. And what happens is these devices also emit light. So you can see these points of light in the space. And then the audience puts on glasses, and these are safety glasses. They're not virtual reality glasses. They have no electronics in them. They're just standard plastic safety glasses, but they've been damaged. We frosted them. We basically sandpapered them. So there's no clear image. And what's interesting is that when you look into the space, you lose complete sense of depth of field. You have no idea how far something is away from you. So right now I can see clearly I have depth of field. I see someone's far in the back. The level of detail is less than the front. So I have this sense of like there is depth in this space. When you put these glasses on, you have really no sense of that depth. And because other people are walking with these actuators where they feel vibration, but they also sense light and see others moving with this light, you get a sense that there's a whole field of kind of moving beings, but you don't really know where they are in space. And it's interesting because we did a workshop with sight impaired people in Poland after a couple of years after this piece was done, and described some of the audience's experience. And many of these sight impaired people said this is exactly how they feel their own sense of sight, where they sense especially these are people, some of the people had congenital blindness, but some had lost their sight over time. And they said, yes, the sense of blurriness, the sense of like not knowing how far something was from their bodies and so on. I mean, the piece is not to make people blind. The piece was to explore the idea of what would happen if touch could be, let's say, circulated among a group of people. So touch is really interesting because it's what we call a proximate sense. It's a sense that's based on like touching, essentially. You touch yourself. It's you have hand that touches your skin. So there's a proximate relation between the touch and the surface that is touching you. So if you put on your watch, if you have an actuator, it produces a vibration right here at a very local level. The idea of touch moving in a group, well, that's a strange idea. So we try to start off with this idea, what does it mean to think about touch circulating among a group of people like a cloud, as opposed to like someone directly touching you? So what would it feel like to be touched from a distance? Now, it's really interesting because we were working at the time with a cultural anthropologist, David Howes, who's an expert at the sense and kind of understanding the senses from a very specific cultural standpoints and social standpoints. And there are a lot of interesting cultures where touch is very predominant. In our predominantly, let's say, strongly visual culture in Europe or come from North America, touch is not seen as so important. It's what was called one of the lower senses. Like you have a kind of hierarchy of senses. Vision, which occupies a lot of your brain. Vision is the top sense, and then second is audition, and the third is touch. And then the so-called lower senses are touch, and then the chemical senses, which are predominantly smell and taste. These are all molecular senses. The senses are mechanical, or they're chemical in that sense. So touch is kind of in the middle, but it was never seen as a real serious sense, particularly post 1600s or so. Early on in the Middle Ages, touch was very predominant. People didn't have chairs; they were next to each other. They were very close to each other. They smell. There's a very strong sense of people's proximity that you felt, and gradually that disappeared. Chairs came in play. And essentially the senses started kind of separating, you might say, at least in their kind of hierarchies we understand them in. So what this project tries to do is invert the senses we're familiar with, which is usually vision to navigate space, and start relying on senses you don't think about. Your sense of touch, but also a sense which is extremely interesting, which is not one of the so-called 5 senses, which comes to us from the Greek philosopher Aristotle, but the sense of what we call proprioception. And the proprioceptor is essentially on the skin, and they give you a sense of your body in space. So you might have a feeling like when you have the sense of somebody behind you. Well, how do you know they're behind you? Well, there's a sense of your body in space and how you relate to others around you. So that is a sense which is very interesting, and it's a combination of touch, of sight, hearing, of your vestibular system in terms of your balance, all of these things. So this project tries to explore that. And what we do is simply send these 20 people into a series of spaces that they navigate through. And these spaces are tuned in different ways. They're tuned in terms of, some are very saturated in light, some are very quiet, some are very loud, some have hanging lights swinging from the ceiling, so people confuse the space and their bodies. It's very interesting because then there's no time limit. People sometimes stay hour and a half. Some people got lost in this. We have to find them again. Some go out very quickly. But it's really about trying to understand what happens when the senses we rely on to navigate, literally physically navigate, move through the world, can no longer rely on them. Okay? So this is interesting. We'll come back to this in a little bit. All right. The second project I'm going to briefly talk about is this project. Now, this is called Sense Factory. This was in 2019, right before COVID hit. So, and I will show you a video of it in a second. This is different in the sense that your job is to navigate a space which is very large. This space is 30 meters long by 13 meters wide by 8 meters high. And it's composed of two elements, actually 3 elements, but one element is this inflatable structure. So this is all made of plastic, and it's filled with air, so it's inflated. Now it looks relatively easy. You come in, you go through there, there's a passage there, you go through there, essentially like a labyrinth, you get to the back. But what happens in this space is that architecture does not remain stable. It inflates and deflates over time. And there's passages that you go into, and if it inflates, you might be blocked in that passage. You might be stuck between the walls. You might be under the floor. You might be in some strange configuration. And it's not just you. There's about 50 to 60 people at a time trying to navigate, to move through this space. I use navigate in a very specific way because, of course, you have affordances for action. You have, which we'll talk about in a second, this idea of an affordance, which is something that your perception needs to hang on to in order to move through the world. And so what happens is you move through these corridors and they're changing their shape. There's another element too, which is the level of brightness or the level of color. Those things change as well. So for instance, sometimes this room goes completely dark for various reasons, which I won't go into right this second. Sometimes it gets very, very bright. Sometimes what happens is you have light on the walls, and as the light is changing, it's essentially what we might call oscillating. It's switching very fast back and forth. You tend to see things that your brain produces images, or let's say interference patterns that are not really in the color in the way the light works. So there's strange perceptual things happening in this space that, let's say, make your navigation through this environment challenging, right? It's not just getting from point A to point B, because you're encountering not only physical obstacles, you're encountering perceptual obstacles, and you're also encountering other people. And these other people are hanging on to these surfaces as they expand and contract. They're lying on the floor on other surfaces. Some people, as I said, are hidden behind walls, like you see in the back. There's a kind of room, this kind of thing in the back that kind of blows up and hides people so they can't get out. There's another room where you go in and you cry because there's a certain kind of smell in the air. So it's quite a strange experience. That's what we call it, Sense Factory. It's based on thinking coming from the Bauhaus in the 1920s from Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, who was interested in creating a theater of machines based on the senses. So he described theater that would challenge all your senses. It would challenge your sense of smell, your sense of movement, your sense of balance, your sense of seeing, hearing, and feeling. Okay, so there's that. And then the last project I'm going to talk about in the kind of more theoretical discussion is this project called Reconfigure. And this was just done also by the Immersive Art Space. This is very recent. This is a project that also deals very much with the relation of your body in a digital environment. Okay, the digital environment is projected. What happens is we have a certain kind of system that allows you to scan your body, take essentially a 2D image, and then that 2D image is translated into a 3D avatar, into a moving, rigged body, and then appears in a projection with a number of other people who've also been scanned. So you're with the audience members you enter into the space with. And what happens is you see these imperfect visions of yourself floating and doing kind of strange things. So this is a very strange experience because it is you, but it's the way the machine interprets you. And in talking to visitors, we were showing this last year in Paris and in Milan and in Madrid and in various places in Europe, what happens is that the audience describes experience of seeing themselves, but seeing themselves moving in ways that they would not move in. So you have this strange relationship between this moving avatar that is you, but is not you, and your own physical sense of presence in space. Kind of see these things moving. This is in Linz. I'll show you another video in a second. So these are these kinds of bodies floating in space. I have better video. So here's a better sense of what this is. So these are different versions of this piece at different setups. And we're using a set of neural networks to do this reconstruction. So by the moment you scan yourself to the moment you appear is very fast. It's under 10 seconds. So this is the scanning process. You're captured and you're converted. And then you see, this is the beginning of the loop. This is about a 12-minute loop. You see these entities that are you, then they kind of go through this kind of transformation. They're all floating in this space. This is, of course, projected on a screen, and they all tend to follow each other. So they go through various transformations. They become like fish. So at the end they lose all shape of any form of, they look kind of like bodies, but they have no more representation. And they kind of come back together, and they then fall away into space, and the whole cycle restarts again. And as I said, what's interesting is that when you see yourself and you see yourself surrounding yourself, very strange things start to happen. You start to question whether or not what you're seeing is really you, or question, are you there or are you there, or here? So this tension happens between your representation on the screen and your own physical experience of that representation. So those are the three pieces I want to talk about. And I just show you how that is done. That is done with a system that was developed in our lab, which essentially takes a two-dimensional video and turns it into this animation. I'll just quickly scan through this. This is a long video. So basically, you take an input of somebody, And this was done with an iPhone. And then you do what's called pose estimation, which tries to figure out, the computer tries to understand essentially the skeleton of your body. So it understands there's actually a body there, because machines know nothing about it. It's actually looking at a body from the camera point of view. Then it does some computer vision things where it takes the body out of the environment and segments it, tries to reconstruct it. And what happens is, on the first level of reconstruction, it's pretty good. It's using, basically, it builds a mesh. What's really strange, though, is that, of course, you see here the head is on the back of the head, in this odd way. It's because the system doesn't know anything about a body, and it certainly doesn't know the difference between front and back. It assumes that what's on the front is on the back, and we're using a specific kind of neural network called the generative adversarial network to do this. Now, over time, it gets better. This is how this does just this texturing. So you can see, for instance, there you see the head, and you see the jacket on the front kind of looks like the jacket on the back. But over time, it trains and it learns that, in fact, it has to kind of reconstruct the back. It's just so then it gets better. You can see there's still noise in that figure. The feet are always very weird because the feet are very difficult to capture based on lighting and a lot of technical issues. And then but it gets better. And now what happens is then you can see there's still noise in it, and then what happens is we can rig it and animate it. So this is what's called auto rigging. It basically controls the joints and the kinematics of the model. And you can see then basically what we can do is then we can take that still image of you and then animate that. Now, as I said, this process happens really, really fast. It happens under 10 seconds, which is really fast. Now, it's not that the image is incredibly high resolution, but in the context we're using it in, it doesn't need to be. It's better to have it done quickly than to have it at the level of detail that you might need in the laboratory, because we're putting it into an artistic context that's very different. Okay, I'm going to skip this. This is so those are the three kind of projects that deal with different ways of understanding how we might think about our body in relationship to the environment we're in. Now this is just the space. So I just show you very quickly this video. Shows a little bit of, this was just last semester. These are mainly student projects. It's just the light is really very bad. Yeah, maybe there's a, that's better. Thanks. So just, these are different projects that are done. So this is we're doing a lot of work with, again, like digital environments in which human bodies are in them. This is motion, we have a big motion capture system. We're using a lot of real-time motion capture. So motion capture, of course, is basically capturing, using system to capture essentially the body with a set of cameras and then reconstructing that as well. These are just different different kinds of visualization.
And if you want to make
Anyway, so I'll just jump forward. And then basically what we're doing is outputting academic papers, artistic works, and creative software and hardware. Now, what we're working on, and this gets me into the kind of second part of my talk, is on the idea of what does it mean to be a sensing entity, like I started off at the beginning. And people have probably heard the term spatial computing. This is a term that comes from the 1990s, even though Apple computer with its Vision Pro says they invented it, but it's an old term. And it basically means, how does a computer understand and manipulate the real environment when it has to understand something about real bodies, objects, and space? Real things, not representations to the machine, but things that are actually in the physical environment, okay? And So it goes to this idea. What does it mean to be a body in a sense environment? What does it mean a sensing body in the environment? Okay, I'm going to play you a video. So this is haptic field. This shows you a little bit of that piece. And just as a way of thinking about that question, what does it mean to sense the environment that itself might be sensing you?
Haptic field tries to create a kind of experience where the senses start to merge and mix together. Visitors arrive and they put on a garment. When one is in this suit, one emits light and one also feels vibration. People put on these goggles, which basically cloud their vision, and then they move through a series of rooms that have varying levels of sensory input. You don't really have a sense of depth. You only see other people moving as shadows that emit light. So there's a kind of weird communication happening between each body in the room. And then you start to move through the other spaces. Occasionally the room completely becomes white. At times it becomes very, very dark. Suddenly the walls seem to emit light. The final space is saturated in a kind of dim color, which is changing very gradually. In many ways, the visitor's experience is the content of the work. There's an incredibly wide range of experiences that people describe, from terror to ecstasy to a kind of meditative state. I see the work as a relation between people and their environments and how those things are merging and interacting with each other.
Yeah, so that's this idea again of people and their environment and how these things interact with each other, especially when the environment itself is changing, is dynamic, is unstable. All right, so now I want to give you some ideas of where this might come from. And so everyone probably knows this idea of the so-called of mind-body, right? It's a thing we inherit from Descartes, but also earlier. There's this idea that you have a thinking body, you have a physical body, right? You have basically the mind, which of course involves the brain, but also then this mysterious thing called the mind that makes thought happen somehow. And then you have the body, which seems to be somehow separate. And this is what we call in philosophy dualism, that there's a split between two things. Okay. And this quote kind of emphasizes that this is not just in mind body, but our understanding of the environment and the person or the organism in the environment is also dualistic. It's been split up. So when we say is, quote, although not acknowledged, the debate around whether cognition is representational versus an embodied process, I'll explain this in a second, is centered on the degree to which cognitive researchers are willing to let go of the various forms of dualism that has shaped the history of traditional cognitive and psychological science. At the forefront, you have mind-body dualism, but you have also split between, in linguistics, semantics and syntax, meaning and structure, and perception versus action. We'll talk about this in a second. And most importantly, this organism environment. Now, these are all these dualistic ideas. So what does this mean, this idea of representation versus embodiment? So, and this is very simplified, but so there have been arguments for a long time in cognition that the world that we inhabit as bodies is somehow pre-given as inside the brain, okay? And that what the brain does is then essentially allow us to understand that world based on the model that's already been built up in the brain. This is what's called a computationalist point of view. And it's very predominant in early cognitive science, starting, let's say, post-war in the 1940s, but it's also very predominant in a discipline that everyone's heard about, which is artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence, even now, of course, works on principles of what we call connectionism, which is essentially the idea that intelligence is built up from individual units called neurons, and that basically those neurons connect and combine and create something we call, let's say, action or intelligence. I'll put that in quotes because it's a big, complicated term. Whereas early artificial intelligence was based on the idea that we have symbols, and those symbols basically represent something in the world, and the idea is to operate mathematically on those symbols. That's why we call it symbolic artificial intelligence. This is not so predominant anymore, although people are arguing it should come back for various reasons. But this is kind of early ideas that cognition is about representing somehow the world already given in the head, whereas the rest of the organism, like your arms and your legs and your chest and your feet, and they're not so important to things like reasoning or problem solving or these kinds of things. Then there's a whole other group of researchers who come from biology, also come from cognitive science, come from philosophy, and come from areas like robotics, who argue that you cannot have intelligence without having a body. It simply makes no sense, because we're not just brains floating around in the world, not just thinking machines, as the term might go. We're also acting machines. We act in the world by having something that's connected to our brain. So the neural system is not just the brain, but it's also the muscular skeletal system. And these researchers call this what we call sensory motor, meaning we have senses and we have motor action that are related. And this is interesting because this is a tug of war that still takes place about how we consider cognition. And there's lots of debates and arguments about this in the sciences, but also in philosophy, and also as I said, in computer science now with AI. So let's just for a moment say that this cut between the mind and the body, just like we think about our computers, we think about software, we think about hardware. Well, software is what does the thinking for your computer, and hardware is what processes that software. That's also a dualism as well, this cut between, like, there's software and hardware. Early computers, for instance, were only hardware. There was no software. You had big cables, you had big, like, patch cords. You had to, like, plug those patch cords. You had no programming languages. And basically, you know, all the computation happened by basically changing the amount of electricity going into vacuum tubes. Okay. And then software comes in the end of the 1940s. And then, of course, you start to have this dualistic split between, well, there's the code, there's where the thinking, the logic takes place, and then there's the machine, the central processing unit, memory registers, input, output, peripherals, all these things that then do that processing. Okay. So let's for a moment say, let's suspend this idea that there's this cut and think about a relation to things, that without the environment, our bodies cannot perceive the world, and without our bodies, the environment can't be there. That these things are mutually impacting and related to each other. Okay. So in this one interesting article, there's 6 maybe ideas, and we can discuss this. We'll, of course, afterwards read a little bit of Arakawa Gins to maybe understand this more in a kind of concrete way. But I'm just going to put these out there, and we can come back to them after I finish. And it's what we call a kind of ecological theory of perception. Okay. So this ecological theory of perception is based on the idea that the environment that we are in, like the physical environment, has things in it that our perception actively needs to grasp in order for us to understand how to move in it, how to make sense, how to move through the world. Okay. And so the idea of this ecological perception is that there's something that the environment offers up, which is what J.J. Gibson, psychologist who came up, was one of the, let's say, thinkers who was working within this kind of context, called an affordance. Okay. And an affordance is something which remains stable, or what he called invariant, in the environment, in the world, that offers our perception some way of making sense of that environment. And Gibson focuses predominantly on seeing, but there's a lot of work also on other senses as well. So there's 6 kind of ideas that I'm going to throw at you. I'm not trying to explain them too much because they're complex, but let's assume that, as I said, the the environment we're in is giving us ways, giving our perception ways to try to make sense of it. Okay. And let's give up this idea that our eyes and our nose and our ears and all these things are waiting for information like stimuli that we then make sense of in our brain. Let's take another idea. Let's take the idea that our body is actively involved in perceiving the world. And in order to understand something, we have to move toward it. We have to turn our head. We have to actively smell something. We're very, very active in our perception. It doesn't mean physical movement. It can also be like we're searching, we're scanning, we're trying to listen at a distance, we're trying to see far away. We're trying to do all these things that are active to tell us how we make sense, how we move through a space, how we understand how far something is or how close it is. How do we understand something it's dangerous to us or not? All these things are very, very active. So the first idea is that the organism, and we abstract it from a person for a moment, just say an organism could be not just a human, it could also be a biological organism. Even an organism doesn't have a brain, like a slime mold, or very low-level organisms like ants that maybe don't have very sophisticated brains, but actually have very sophisticated sensing systems where they know when to move towards something or move far away. So let's say the organism environment are mutual and reciprocal, that they need each other, okay? And Gibson, this psychologist I was talking about, has this concept that he says, the animal, being maybe us or other biological entities, are inseparable, okay? The animal and the environment are inseparable from each other. They're deeply connected. Each implies the other. There's not one without the other. No animal could exist without an environment surrounding it, right? Well, this makes sense. When living systems are essentially after one thing, which is to sustain themselves, to survive. And so, of course, they're going to move through environments that sometimes are hostile. So they're completely have to be aware of how that environment offers up clues to how they respond, and vice versa. Equally obvious, not so obvious, an environment implies an animal, or at least an organism, to be surrounded. So in other words, somehow that the environment also develops according to the kind of entities in that environment. So you see, both of these things are dependent on each other as opposed to being separate. That's the first idea. Okay, this is a bit more complicated, but I just brought up this idea of an affordance. So an affordance for Gibson is something, and this for Gibson, it's light. It's how light hits surfaces. How, for instance, if I'm looking at this wall, okay, do I know that there's a corner? How do I know that that's not flat? So from a distance, I can look at that, and if I don't see, I might perceive that corner is actually flat. It's like one dimension. But how do I know it's actually 3 dimensions? Well, if I go up to it and I touch it, and I realize, okay, this wall goes here and this wall goes there. There's a break. But if I stand away from it, how do I know? Well, what Gibson says is the way that light hits the surface gives our visual system, and maybe even also our motor system, if we move towards something and move away from it, gives us a sense of that we're looking not at a flat thing, but at something that has shape, right, dimensions to it. And it's because the light hits the surface in such a way that I see at one point there's more light on one side and there's shadow on another. It's what he called an optical array. But what it really is this an affordance for us to act, because we're not going to stand there from a distance and say, okay, I know what it looks like. I might have to move my body and see, in fact, this is now not so flat. It's actually, there's actually one wall here and one wall there. So what this implies is that, he says, surfaces, substances, places, objects, and events. And this is different, of course. That's a surface, but a place, a thing, something that happens out in the space, like say a car backfires. How do you know where that car is? Well, your hearing system is very good at knowing where things are in space, essentially also how far away they are. how loud or how soft is something? How threatening is it? If it's far away, you might say that's not threatening. If it's very close, you say, well, that's threatening, I'm going to move. This is how we've developed, of course, as over evolutionary time. So that these things offer the possibility for acting, okay? Meaning actively perceiving and making sense. And so an affordance, and this is a very useful term, it's used in design research all the time, slightly different perhaps than how Gibson imagined it, but affordance are the information offered by the environment that the human or the animal acts on, okay? And what's really interesting is you can play with these affordances in space. You can shift, for instance, how you see light on the surface, or how far something away is, or so on. Does anyone ever heard of the work of James Turrell? Yeah, so of course, yeah. I mean, Turrell is one of my kind of artistic heroes, along with Robert Irwin, who is similar, passed away this year actually. But Turrell, I just show you quickly a very good example of this kind of affordance. And Turrell makes basically big light sculptures. And he has a series of very early works in the end of the 1960s. So these are big environments that involve a concept from psychology called a Ganzfeld. And Ganzfeld is quite simple. A Ganzfeld is a field of featureless light. There's no features. In other words, in a Ganzfeld, there's no affordance for your perception to latch onto. The place you experience it the most is when you walk into a bank of fog. You know, when you have no sense of how far something is or how close it is. There's nothing your perception can handle or hang on to. And Turrell has made a whole career of building rooms that involve these kinds of perceptual transformations. But there are these works. Let's see if I can find one here. These works in fact, here at the ETH, there's a drawing collection that has some of these works. I just saw it the other day. But these are really early works, these corner works. And what's really interesting is this illustrates, I think, very much this concept of affordance I talked about. So now, from a distance, this looks like a cube, right? Looks like a three-dimensional volume that's in space. But in fact, it's not. It's a light projection in the corner of that room. So from a distance, you see essentially this object. But what you realize as you move around, as you change your position, as you change your body's position, is that this object is actually not an object at all. It's actually a flat plane of light. And this is quite interesting because Turrell's work very much plays with this idea that the environment and the perceiver in the environment are actively working together. Now, this room doesn't sense, it stays static. He did some other works where, in fact, the room tries to sense what you do and then respond accordingly. But what's interesting is this thing comes into your perception as you actively engage with it. What's interesting is like the first Turrell has other works that involve extreme darkness. And what's really quite interesting is, and of course, it's very difficult. This is a very early version of it. It's difficult to show these works because, of course, they involve darkness. It's hard to capture them in images. But some of his work, so if you take this kind of, this is a very large Ganzfeld in Mass MoCA in the United States. But some of his works, you enter into. So I remember the first time I saw one of these works from James Turrell, and it was in Frankfurt about 15 years ago, and you enter into a dark, long corridor. So it's completely dark. So you can't see anything really, and you come into a room which is about a little longer than this space, and the room is totally black. You don't see anything, and you can't even walk very fast because you're afraid of stumbling on the floor. You don't know if there's seats. You don't know if other people in the room. It's extremely dark. And gradually, you see in the distance some kind of strange thing. Looks like flickers of light. It might be what we call phosphenes. Phosphenes are things that also the retina and brain cooperation with each other produce where you can't see. So you suddenly you start to see things that are images on the retina, like flashes, but maybe they're not there. They're not in the real space. They're in the retinal and the nervous system. But what's super interesting is that gradually you start seeing actually a form in space. You start seeing there is actually something in front of me. Now you don't know where it is. It could be in front of me like here. It could be in front of me where you're sitting. It could be way in the back of the room with the last wall, but you don't know it. And your eyes are gradually adjusting to the light in the room. And what's interesting is you see on the walls, on the left and right wall, you see these two pin spots of light coming from track light. And so your eye starts to adjust and say, oh, okay, this is a room. Okay, it's not just a vast empty space. There's a space. There's the walls. There's something on the wall. There seems to be light there and light there. And then you start seeing a rectangle appear in front of you. And again, you don't know if your brain is producing that or if the room is producing that. But as you move to the side, as you move closer, this starts to come more into vision, you know? And this process, and I remember timing it, this process took me about 25 minutes before I really saw this thing in space. And you get closer, and what it looks like is a kind of rectangle on a wall, like a frame. And it's like it's a blue painting, basically. It's like kind of like when you're at dusk, a little darker than this blue in that image. And you realize that there's actually something there that is not just in your brain, it's in the environment. And there's this relationship between your perception and the environment happening in this quite interesting way. And finally, I remember my kind of shock is when you get closer to this and you realize it's really quite large. It's like this huge, like the size of this room, this huge image. And you realize when you get up to it that there's no image at all. There's a hole in space and you can put your hand through it. And it's basically a cutout of the room, and there's light around the periphery which you can't see, which is tungsten black light. So it's at a color temperature which your eye cannot really detect features very well. And you realize that there's a room inside a room which is illuminated by this black light, by this tungsten light. And you're going like, okay, it's not only that my perception was confused by the fact that there was nothing there at the beginning. Over time, I realized there is something there, but it turns out to not even be something. It turns out to be essentially a hole in space, which my perception has told me is an object, but in fact turns out to be a space. And I think this is a good way of describing this idea of an affordance, that there is an affordance for action. So what we can think about is this idea that the organism perceives, in order for the organism to perceive this object, this place, this event, is to perceive essentially a kind of meaning in it. In other words, that the meaning is linked to the form, the thing itself, and what it is, and our relationship to it. Okay, so what's important here is that the idea that there's things in the space that offer us ways of acting. And those ways of acting, as I described to you, if I just stood there and I waited for this thing to come, maybe I would see it, maybe I wouldn't see it, but by the fact of moving closer, my eye adjusts to the change of color in the space, because the LEDs are fixed. They don't change their brightness. My eye brings them into being, because it's there all the time. If I walked into the room and I had not been in darkness for 10 minutes before, I would gradually see this. And so, of course, when you go back to this, it's there. And so you kind of adjust very quickly to it. Now, that's the idea of the kind of a surface. But here's, as I said in Sense Factory, a way that your body adjusts to changing surfaces in the space. So this is this environment that changes its shape. Now here, the affordances of action are themselves in motion. That's how people had to get into the space, because they wait for that things to deflate. And then these are people kind of moving in this space. This is like again, a surface that an object has been deflated, then moved, then reinflate. People who are coming out of it because they were on it, and then it deflated and put them on the ground. So that's a little bit about affordance. I'll finish up in a second. So the third idea is this idea of behavior in this kind of environment is emergent, or what we call self-organized. So self-organization is a complex idea, but to give you a simple definition, self-organization is the idea that there is no central control in a system. That in fact, the way the system is structured is based on the different components of the system connecting and interacting with each other. And usually it means at a local level. So there's no global control over the system. It's only at local parts of the system that things change. And in this case, there's this idea that the behavior of an organism doesn't just come from a single place, like the brain or a single muscle. It comes from this whole interplay of the brain, the body, the environment, and the information that's given to you from that environment. So there's this mutual interaction taking place between all of these different components. And that information is not just coming from one direction or another, it's constantly changing. So it's dynamic in that sense. Okay. Okay, this is a lot of text, but I just say that basically the third is this, the fourth idea is that perceiving and acting are continuous and coupled. In other words, there's not a separation between I perceive something and I act. These things are mutually shaping each other. Okay, and you can see in some of these examples I'm giving you that those things happened. Now, here is an example of this in kind of maybe an action. So this is the work from Arakawa and Gins in the Museum of Contemporary Art in Nagi in Japan. I'll show you a video on it in a second. But what is interesting about this piece is, so you enter, this is a tube, like a giant cylinder, and you enter into this cylinder. And you come through a staircase, you're in one part of this building, and then you in the basement, then you come up through a staircase and you come into this black void, and you come into this tube, into this cylinder. And what you're confronted with is, you can see very easily, is a mirror image from the ceiling to the floor of the same thing. And this seesaw here and this bench, you can see, of course, this is a cylindrical form, so it's wrapped, is the actual object is on the ceiling. Now, there's another thing that's going on as well, which is what they've done is they've taken a famous site in Japan, in Kyoto, in a famous temple, which is called the Ryoanji Temple. And in the Ryoanji Temple, you have a very, very famous rock garden. You've probably seen this on postcards or so. And when you look at that rock garden, I've been to that rock garden. You can't walk in it. You have to sit on a little small, like little balcony and look at it. And you can always only look at it from one direction. You can move your body to one place and you see kind of the side. You can move here and see, but you can't go in the garden. Okay. Now, what's so strange is this garden is wrapped around the walls of this space. And I have not been here. I'm actually going to Japan in December to finally see this, but I've talked to people who have. And what they describe is when they come out of that, this is the staircase, they come out of the staircase into the space. They describe it, when they look at the ceiling, they see this seesaw and this chair or this bench. And their body is completely disoriented, does not know what to do. Because of course you say, well, of course, if I sit down on the seesaw, it does this teeter-totter does one thing, but because it's a mirror image on the ceiling, not just an image, but the actual architecture, your body feels like it's flipped upside down. It doesn't know how to make sense of the space. And of course, the other thing is, for those who have been to that actual rock garden, is suddenly that thing is on the sides. So it inverts your perception. So it would be like basically taking this room and taking a mirror image and putting it on the ceiling. So when we came in, all the chairs and tables are on the ceiling. What would our bodies do? And this is really interesting. Of course, it's fixed. It's not changing digitally. But your sense of what happens if you have a sense of kind of outer body experience in some ways. You say, what would it mean for me to sit upside down, hanging from the ceiling? Of course, I can't do that because there's something called gravity that's taking place, But what would happen if I actually could do that? What would be this feeling of suspension? And of course, people who do things like suspend themselves in the air, they want to do aerial yoga or bungee jumping. Of course, you're also losing the sense of gravity. The physics of the environment changes. But this is very interesting because the affordances for action here present your body with challenges that it just may not be able to perceive. And so it challenges how you sense yourself in that space. That's the actual space. I'll just run this little video. This is a description. What do they say? As if magnetized. This is Arakawa again saying the body moving in a veering, unbalanced balance. This is very interesting. Unbalanced balance loses all sense of identity, or casts the little that remains of its identity as a person outside of itself. If the body proper loses its bearings within the symmetrically organized container, it is up to all the landing sites. We'll talk about this later, what this means. Arrayed throughout the entire interior of the cylinder, plus the visitor's body proper, functioning palpably in combination as an architectural body, to institute new sets of bearings. In other words, what this environment does to you is ask you to you can't approach this physically in your own body in a routine way, because this has completely changed, or it's like trying to basically throw your sense of body and also maybe even of self, which is another whole thing we can talk about, a sense of identity, they say, away. So you are kind of rethinking your own sense of your body in this environment. Here's a short video on that.
Welcome to the Nagimoka Nagi Museum of Contemporary Art. This amazing museum is located in Nagi Town, Okayama Prefecture in Japan. The museum opened in 1994. The building was designed by Arata Isozaki, who selected 4 artists to collaborate with him from the beginning. Today, visitors can experience 3 permanent installation works by Aiko Miyawaki, Kazuo Okazaki, and Arakawa and Madeline Gins. This is the entrance of the ubiquitous site Nagi's Ryoanji architectural body, also known as the Sun Room. You will find a spiral staircase in the next low-light room. It's a bit dark, so be careful. Please climb up the stairs and let your body lose itself to an undiscovered world. After climbing up the spiral staircase, you enter a huge sloped cylinder. You will see a green ceiling and a red floor, which are complementary colors. In the space, there are a pair of seesaws and pull-up bars. One is life-scale, and the other one, which is attached onto the ceiling, is 1.5 times bigger. You can of course play with the seesaw and iron bar on the ground. You might wonder, how could I also play with the ones attached on the ceiling? Then you will realize that 2 replicas of Ryoanji Temple's famous rock garden are placed on the curved walls, giving visitors a bird's eye view of the scenery. You would never be able to see the rock garden from this angle at the real Ryoanji. Here, you start feeling as if you are flying above the rock garden. You are standing on the floor, but the floor is not flat, because you are in the sloped cylinder. All of those architectural elements make you feel a sensation of weightlessness without using virtual reality technology or any other electronic machines, but just by changing your bodily perception. Arakawa and Gins believed that architecture has a huge potential to change the circumstances of our lived space, or kehai as we say in Japanese, our living atmosphere. And they understood that they could rely on it to move forward toward realizing their concept of reversible destiny. Before reaching the entrance of the sunroom, there is a gallery where viewers can see some drawings by Arakawa and Gins.
Okay, I'll just go on. Number 5, perception is direct perception and specific. So this is this idea that there is, let's say, patterns of information that the environment offers up that we then interpret and make sense of. And the last thing before I stop is this idea that perception, as I said earlier, is affordance-based. That ecologically knowing is a relation, it's epistemic, it's a relation to knowing something between the animal, someone that knows something, and the environment, which is what is to be known by that animal. So again, going back to this work from Gibson, to perceive is to perceive affordances, the opportunities for action in the environment. So that's, again, very interesting with Arakawa and Gins, good example. It's like you sit down and you see this bar. And so what does it feel like to sit on the ceiling? You know, you ask your body asks that question. It's not just to ignore it because, of course, it's a physical thing. It's offering up some form of question, but also opportunity to act in a certain way. And so you see, for instance, in the case of that video, she literally, of course, if you saw the rock garden in front of you, you would try to walk into it. So look at the different qualities of stone, the textures, the different shapes, to go around things. So here you try to do that, but of course you can't, because you can only go so far before you fall. So it's very interesting in the sense that how that environment shapes how the affordance of the environment, the curve of the wall, the texture of these rocks, the way you imagine that being flat, but then essentially confronting it that it's not flat, offers you your body ways of acting in that space. So I'm just going to finish and show you one last thing, and then we take a break, which is this is if you get to Japan, and we'll look at this longer. This is a whole park that Arakawa and Gins built called the Site of Reversible Destiny, where you have an entire space where your body can experience this kind of architecture that asks these kinds of questions to you. So these were the three questions we started with, and this will be the ones we come back to for the discussion. How do the physical surroundings invite our action to our body? How far out in the environment does our organism extend, at the person's extent? To what extent do surroundings influence thoughts and actions?